Beowulf manuscript, which is also called the Noel Codex, because in the 16th century, a guy named Lawrence Noel, who was an antiquarian, that means he collected old stuff, okay, had the manuscript, we know, because he wrote his name inside it on the front page of one of the 5 things that's in the manuscript, okay? He did that in the the 3rd quarter of the 16th century, okay? What it's called today, or its shelf mark, if you want, shelf mark, is Cotton Vitellius A15. And I'll tell you why it's called that in just a moment. After Noel owned it, we know that Sir Robert Bruce Cotton, another antiquarian, okay, in the 17th century owned it. Cotton was an even greater collector of old stuff than was Lawrence Noel. How do we know this? Because he collected a lot of books and manuscripts, okay, and he had them in his library, which he eventually donated to England and became the foundation of what is now the British Library. Okay? The British Library is one of the largest libraries in the world. If I remember right, I think Oxford's larger, and then you have the British Library, and then maybe the Library of Congress, or it's, those 3 are in the top 3, okay? So Cotton owned a large number of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. I've been, what was it I was just reading? Just reading something about Cotton and the fire. And Cotton owned something like 998 manuscripts, okay, handwritten books, right, in addition to printed materials. In 1731, the library that he had donated, okay, to the crown or to England, was in a house by the Thames. Okay, Cotton was dead by this time. Okay, it was in what's called Ashburnham House. That was the name of the house in Westminster, an area of London, on the Thames, and the house caught fire. Okay, people knew that the library was on the 2nd floor, which in England's 2nd floor, it's our 3rd floor. They call the first floor above the ground, okay, where we call that 2nd floor. So the kitchen caught fire, and the fire started to spread. People ran to the library, okay, and tried to rescue as much material as they could. They eventually got to the point of what they were doing is pulling manuscripts out of the bookcases and throwing them out the window. Okay? A lot of stuff was destroyed. I think over 100 manuscripts were burned, totally burned to a crisp, not worth anything at all. Okay? So let me back up for a minute. In this library, if the library was like this room, and it probably wasn't much bigger than this room, okay? The way Cotton organized his materials in his personal library before it got moved to Ashburnham House was he had what they called at the time, book presses, okay? We would call them bookcases. So you'd have a bookcase like on this wall, and it might be, 30 inches wide, 6 or 7 feet tall. When I build bookcases, that's kind of pretty much a standard dimension. And so he had several of these. I can't remember the exact number. It's something like 14 or 16 of them, okay? On top of each of these bookcases, he had mounted a bust of a Roman emperor. So you start with A, like Aurelius, Marcus Aurelius, okay? And you go all the way around the room to V, Vitellius, right? Not one for every letter of the alphabet, okay? So he'd have the book press, he'd have the bust on top, and then he would start from the top of the bookcase down, shelves like this, so you'd have A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. Okay? And then, so you have the bust up here, somebody's head, ears, they're dead, maybe some hair. And so you'd start having books. So you'd have A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Roman numerals. Okay? So the Beowulf manuscript, or the Noel Codex, was located in the book press that had Vitellius on the top. It was on the first shelf, and it was the 15th item in from the left. Okay? Think of this as our modern Library of Congress classification. Cotton's really the first one who does this kind of thing. As far as we know, maybe the ancient library of Alexandria in Egypt had some kind of catalog like this, but we don't know because that library doesn't survive. Cotton comes up with this, okay? He donates all of his books. Fire happens, and that's why you have, when you look at this opening image, okay, of Beowulf in the Beowulf manuscript, that's why this corner, this side's all fine, right? Because that's this part of the manuscript. If you were to take a blowtorch even to this book and were to go all around the edges and stuff, what's going to happen? This part's not going to burn. Why not? What does it lack that this part out here? Oxygen. There's no oxygen crammed between these pages for it to burn. There's lots of oxygen, however, when you light this, and what's going to happen? This starts to curl, okay? And that's exactly what you see. Top of the book, okay, and the outer edge. And you can see where, and I could bring in a facsimile of it, you've lost a good little portion here, okay? And we've lost even more in the 300 almost years, okay, since the fire. That is, a handwritten copy of Beowulf was made in the late 18th century. Okay? This is kind of the early 18th century. In about 1785, a guy had a copy made. He actually had 2 copies made. One was copied in modern English script, like, we're writing up here, but cursive. And another one, the guy who copied it, copied the Old English orthography. He didn't know Old English, but he copied the letter forms. Okay? Those 2 copies preserve letters that we no longer see because they've since broken off because of the fragility of the manuscript. Okay? So, that's kind of the background of that. A lot of other stuff, as I said, a lot was destroyed, some was preserved. Okay? It's just been about the last 20 years that we can now actually read some of the burned material. I mean, some of these manuscripts just did this, and they curled up. So they're like blocks of charcoal. And for some reason, people at the British Library in 1800 decided to keep those blocks of charcoal, thinking somebody at some point might be able to determine what this says. And for some of them, we now can. Okay? Similarly, ancient library Herculaneum in England, in Italy, okay, which was destroyed when Vesuvius erupted. Same time Pompeii was destroyed. Okay? This was a great ancient library. It's been recently, last 20, 30 years, discovered, and scholars are starting to be able to read charred manuscripts that were found there. Those aren't manuscripts in terms of pig or calf hide. That is, they're not vellum, they're papyrus, from which we get the word paper. That is, they're reed material. So those things burn a lot easier than does vellum. Okay, so that's the manuscript kind of background. Manuscript dates, as we said the other day, those 4 major poetic codices, they all date from roughly 975 to 1025. So what does that obviously mean? Can Beowulf be more recent then 1025. So this is what's called a terminus quem, okay? The poem can't be any more recent than that. You could fudge on this a little bit. You could say, okay, it might be 1045, but it's not, 15th century, right? So if that's the end point, or the most recent it can be, what's called the terminus quo, the beginning, because obviously Beowulf can be older than this, right? This is when it's written down in the manuscript. But as we all know, things can be passed around how before they get written down? Orally. Songs. Okay? Ballads. One of England's great, kind of literary productions, creations, are ballads. These songs that were probably composed beginning in the early Middle English period. 1200, 1300, like Robin Hood. Robin Hood, the story of Robin Hood starts out as a ballad in terms of the literature. Okay? Those ballads are circulated orally. They're sung kind of campfire to campfire, as it were. And then around 1500, they get written down. You can't read Robin Hood stories, per se, that are much older than about 1500. Though we know the ballads probably began, for Robin Hood at least, 200 or 300 years earlier. When, after all, does Robin Hood occur? The events. 13th century. Okay? In the 1200s. John, Richard's younger brother, okay, who's the bad king in the Robin Hood stories, John is ruling right around the turn of that century, 1200. He loses land in Normandy or in France in 1204. He's forced to sign Magna Carta 1215, etc. Okay? So, something can be a lot earlier than its earliest possible inclusion in a manuscript. So that then raises the question, what are the origins of the poem of Beowulf? And we talked a little bit yesterday or the other day about, the Dream of the Rood. Okay? The Dream of the Rood's in a manuscript that dates from this period. The Rivel Cross dates from possibly as early as 680. Most people will say right around 700. A portion of the Dream of the Rood is on the cross. Does that mean at least that portion of the Dream of the Rood is possibly this early? That's one thing it means. We don't know if that portion that's on the cross was carved on the cross the same time the cross was raised. So it could come later. But it might be this early. Okay? So what about Beowulf? We don't have any other written source for Beowulf. Okay? The name Beowulf shows up in one other written document. It's a non-literary document. That is, it's not fiction or fantasy or however you want to consider literary. It's a charter. It's referring to an area on a map. It's called, what it says is Beowulf's home. Beowulf's home. Now, we don't think it is the Beowulf that is talked about in the poem. Okay? For the simple reason that Beowulf lives up here. And the charter is English. It's talking about land in England. Interestingly enough, there's another charter that also mentions Grindalsmere. Okay, that's English. So you have Beowulf referred to in a charter, and you have Grindal referred to in a charter. But neither of them are referred to in any other literary artifact. Okay? We have no other stories of Beowulf even. Not even oral stories that later get copied down. Beowulf, for example, does not show up in any of the Norse mythology. He doesn't show up in any of the saga stories. Okay? Other characters in Beowulf do. Hermod, Hrothgar, Scyld, they all show up. In fact, that's one of the ways we can say there is historical material in Beowulf. Beowulf's uncle, Helak, is a historical character. according to some early Germanic documents, he's real. Okay? He actually lived. Your introduction mentions, I think it's Jordanes' History of the Goths, says that Healak does his what's called Frisian raid in the year 520. Okay, now what is that? That's fact. Right? If Jordanes is telling us the truth, that's a date. That's something that can be tested, so to speak. Okay? Beowulf doesn't show up in Jordanes. He doesn't show up anywhere else. Right? So, what are the origins? Well, some people say the origins might actually even go back a lot earlier than this. That they might go back to the mid-6th century. Right? But in terms of the kind of story that we have now, you have essentially 3 propositions that are given. An early date, a middle date, and a late date. Okay? The early date. That the poem as we have it, or the poem as it currently exists for the most part, dates from sometime around 700. Okay? And I've got this up here, plus or minus 25 years. That plus or minus 25 years can be applied to each of these. So if you wanted to, you could say 675 to 725 for the early date. Okay? So what does that mean? If the poem or the story, if it dates from roughly 700, then what does that tell us? And I just said, Healak, according to, I think it's Jordanes, says that Healak died in 520 AD. How close is 520 to 700? You're 170 years off, right? 180 years off. Okay, put that in our context. It's closer than we are to whom? George Washington. Okay. So, if that's closer than we are to George Washington, what is the likely composer's, or author's, if you want, knowledge of the events that are being discussed? Clearer, closer. They might be better than our knowledge of George Washington. Okay. What else? What would it then tell us about early Germanic society? It'd be more accurate. Okay. It might give us a better idea of what it was really like. All right. So it might be more authentic in that sense. What are you going to believe? A novel written today about colonial America, or a novel written in colonial America about colonial America? Which is going to be closer? The one written in the time period. So if you want to read about colonial America, read James Fenimore Cooper. That will give you an idea. Okay? Closer at least. Okay? The middle date, 875. Or if you want, you can kind of put it within King Alfred's reign, 871 to 899, and just a little bit later. Okay? What would this do? Notice it removes us by 175, almost 200 years from this period. Okay, so what might it start doing in terms of this period? Romanticize it? Get some things wrong? You know, what do people tend to say about the good old days? Nostalgia? Okay, kind of looking back to when things weren't as bad. Okay, but I hope this is dry erase. In 875, things were pretty bad. Okay, yeah, Alfred's on the throne, but the Danes are still occupying most of England. I mean, Alfred's territory is relatively small. Okay, if you look at the map for a moment in the back of your book, this map, what I showed the other day. Alfred essentially has this area here. Okay? The Danes get the rest. So, about a third. So, they get the lion's share. And even though Guthrum has signed a treaty with Alfred in 878, it doesn't mean all the other Danes have. There are other Danish chieftains. There are other Vikings. Guthrum pledges peace. It doesn't mean Sven, off in the wings, has also pledged peace. Okay? So that's what's going on in the middle. What about then if it's late? I mean, you're 300 years later. You're farther removed away from the historical details that might be more accurate here. What else? It's not like you're looking through a telescope and seeing up close what is far away. It's you're looking at something far away, and what starts to happen to the details and the particulars? You get a little fuzzy. Okay. What else is different between 700 and 1,000? 300 years. When does Christianity come? Roman Christianity. 597. Remember? So you're about only 100 years difference there, as opposed to 400 years difference. Okay? So society, Anglo-Saxon England at this time, it's thoroughly Christian. Thoroughly Christian.
So there might have been some Christian doctrine.
Okay? At this period, there might be some kind of pagan holdouts, or there might be, as we were talking about with the drinking the root, there might be some Christians who are kind of nominal in their Christianity. That is, yeah, they pledge allegiance, but they still kind of are hedging their bets and, wearing a hammer amulet, symbol of Thor, as an example. Okay? So, real authentic, literary. Oral, composition, but if its composition dates from this period, it's not oral. It's entirely literary. Keep in mind what the liter part of that means. It's written. Right? I'm one of those who kind of think it's more this than it is this. Liuza doesn't really say, but I've been at conferences where he has and read quite a bit of his criticism. Liuza's much more in this camp than he is in this camp. Right? And there's a couple other reasons. There are tons of allusions, okay, in Beowulf. Yeah, a lot of them to early Germanic stuff. But there's also biblical allusions, okay? Not references. Jesus is never mentioned. Okay? No characters of the Old Testament are ever mentioned, with two exceptions. Cain and Abel. And that's because what Cain and Abel get involved in are central to the poem. All right? The idea of feud is central to the poem. It's one of the reasons I use this book and not the Norton Anthology, because the Norton Anthology, the last time I used it, had a comment in the introduction where it said the Old English idea of feud is on the periphery of the poem. It's on the outlines. It's on the borders. Whoever said that, I don't remember who the editor of the Old English portion was, but whoever said that hadn't read Beowulf, or not in the original. Feud is at the center of the poem. It's what continually drives the action of the poem. People are getting in one feud after another, okay? And it's important to maintain, or it's important to understand how feud works. How do you end a feud? Think of the American kind of popular culture thing of the Hatfields and the McCoys. How would that end in an Anglo-Saxon fashion? One side's got to kill all of the others. Why? Well, think of that fourfold Germanic ethic I put up. Duty to your Lord, Duty to kin.
Revenge. Revenge of the Lord.
Revenge for your lord or kin. Okay? It's like that sign from the old film, The Untouchables, with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner. When Sean Connery, the old grizzled G-man, is kind of teaching the new young Elliot Ness, and he says, you know, you bring brass knuckles to a fight, they bring a knife to a fight. They bring a knife to a fight, you bring a gun to a fight. They bring a gun, you bring a Tommy gun. They bring one, you bring 5. They kill one of yours, you kill 10 of theirs. What happens? You keep upping the ante until the other side's gone. That's how you win. Annihilation. It's not through the UN. Okay? It's not through peace negotiations. It's not a meeting in Geneva. No, you kill. And we're going to find out fairly early on, that's what Beowulf does. He's going to tell us about, you know, when he was a youth fighting trolls. And how did he fight them? He killed a whole nest of them. That kind of means he wiped them out. He didn't leave any to come back later. Okay? So, highly literate, highly oral. Okay. Open the poem. Look how it begins. Well, let me talk about this first. This is a probable map for the area that Beowulf occurs. If that's any better. Okay? You have Hera there. That's located in the modern town of Lejre. Lejre. But it's pronounced Lejre, like Lejre. Okay? And in fact, archaeological evidence does show a massive hall in Lejre. Okay? In the early 6th century. So right around the time of Hrothgar, according to the date for Higelac's death. Okay? So that area of southern Sweden, which we know historically is where the Gautar, Gautar, are from, okay? Which Ren, this is from Ren's study of Old English, suggests is the Yetas, or the Getas. And then you have the Jutes, or the Eoton. Interesting thing about that word, Eoton, okay, which is the Anglo-Saxon form for Jute, is it's also an Anglo-Saxon word for giant. Okay? And then you have various others, okay, tribes that are mentioned in the poem. The Wilvings, the Vandals, the Helobards, okay, the Franks, the Frisians. Okay. The Frisian array that Higelac's going to go on is on this river, actually. And in an early document, the one mentioned that gives his death, it says, you can still go to the island and see where Helac was buried. Okay? Written in the 6th or 7th century. You can go to the island and you can see, essentially, Helac's bones, or you can see his grave. Helac was supposed to be a giant of sort. He was supposed to be very tall, like 7.5 feet tall. Huge. Okay? So that's that material. That's on D2L. And then I've also got this, which might help clarify the poem. Lisa has something like this also, but he does not have everything that I've got here. So you've got genealogies of the Danes, or who are also called the Schildings. That means sons or children of Shield. Okay? The Yats, or the Geats, however you want to pronounce it. The Swedes, sons of Shilf. Okay? And then I list the feuds and rivalries. Notice, they're not few. Okay? And then pretty much a listing of everybody mentioned in the poem, with a few exceptions. Right? I think people that are mentioned only once or twice are not included in this. Okay. Let me get rid of all this. So look how the poem opens up. It opens with that Old English, as I said the other day. What? Yo, you, listen, take note, something like that. Okay? And the Old English is, as much as I've taught this, I have this memorized. What? We gardena in jaardagum fed kinninga frumje frunan. Who's idleness ellen fremadon? We have heard of the glory in bygone days, of the folk kings of the Spear Danes, how those noble lords did lofty deeds. Notice what the speaker is saying. When are these events?
Long gone.
Long ago. Okay? How do fairy tales often begin?
A long time ago.
Once upon a time. That's essentially what the poet is saying. Once upon a time, okay, the Spear Danes did glorious deeds. But the speaker is saying, we, bringing his audience in with them, saying, we've heard these stories before. The only problem is, we don't have any other recorded story of Beowulf. And as I said, the fire, Cotton's library, it destroyed 100 or so manuscripts. Okay? When we get up to the Shakespearean period or the Renaissance, Henry VIII is responsible for the destruction. Probably of thousands of manuscripts. I mean, kind of personally. Not he tortured them himself, but it's his actions that caused it. The Vikings are responsible for the destruction of manuscripts. Okay? So, what is it he's saying we have heard? The glory in bygone days, that's Yerdagum, literally, when I tell my Old English students, I'm teaching Old English now at the graduate level, what I tell my Old English students is if you can use words that derive today from Anglo-Saxon words, use those. Try to keep it in native English terminology. Okay? Yardagum is literally year of days. But we don't say year of days. We say days of yore. The yore means years. Days of long gone years. Okay? How we've heard of in days of yore are the folk kings of the Spear Danes. That's the Gardena. Gar is the word for spear. You can go up to the go up to the zoo, go into the aquarium part, and you can see garfish. Why are they called garfish? Because they have these long spear-like snouts. Okay? How those noble lords did lofty deeds. And he immediately jumps into Oft skuld skeving tjäderna fratu monigum maithu merusetla oftea ersoda erlas seven erist where fish oft funded. There's that word oft. Is it often? Is it always? Scyld Skeving, he's a named person. Scyld, son of Shafe. Shafe here means sheaf. And a lot of scholars have said, oh, we're immediately into some kind of agricultural / fertility god. Okay? Seized the mead benches from many tribes. Seized. Okay? The Old English is he off tea. Off. Okay, that's pretty clear. But the tea part, it doesn't mean seized. Okay? It really means destroyed. Because what does seized sound like? He marched into their hall and said, sorry, I need to borrow this. Can I take your meat bench now? Not what is meant. What is meant is, he kills them all. That's how he takes their meat benches. Okay? From many tribes, troops of enemies struck fear into earls. So, based on these three lines, describe Shildshevin. Okay, good leader. What else? What would we call him in the 21st century? What else would we call him? What would you call somebody who marched in and took somebody else's? Okay, you can't think of this as, just benches. As, a group of people who marched in and took over a city. Tyrant? Terrorists? Okay, but this is Anglo-Saxon. Okay. Invader? Yeah. He's not a migrant. He isn't migrating. Okay. He does what? He struck fear into earls. Though he first was found a waif, he awaited solace for that. Okay. First was found a waif. He arrived how? Well, we're going to find out in the ensuing lines. He arrives in a boat as a child. Make you think of anybody? Sound kind of like Moses, as they say in the Ten Commandments film. Kind of. Okay? Notice he arrives in a boat as a child, and he becomes a what for the people that he arrives to? A deliverer. Biblical allusion? I think so. A lot of scholars don't think that's a biblical allusion at all. I don't know how they don't see that, unless they're biblically illiterate, which most Anglo-Saxon scholars aren't. But anyways, so he awaited solace for that. That is, he awaited consolation for what? For being a foundling, for being an orphan, essentially. He, what? He grew under heaven and prospered in honor. The word grew there is he waxed under heaven. Like the moon waxes and wanes. What does that mean it waxes? Grows larger. He gets larger under heaven. Not just physically. Okay? His fame also grows. How much? Grew under heaven, prospered in honor, until every one of the encircling nations over the whales riding. It's real clear, right? The whales riding had to obey him, grant him tribute. Notice the footnote. Whales riding, a condensed descriptive image of the sea, the riding place of whales. Okay, then why not just say the sea? Had to obey him, grant him tribute. What does that mean? Every one of the surrounding areas had to grant him tribute. Well, go back to the map for a moment. Where is Shildshevin on this map? Yeah, right there where Herat becomes. So the surrounding, think of the people on the coast of where it is labeled the Geatas, probably down around the Heathobards, the Angles, and the Jutes. So what's this telling us about him? Okay, he's a ruler. What kind? You want to mess with him? No. How badly do you not want to mess with him?
Very badly.
Yeah. To the point where he demands tribute, and you say, how much? Okay? Okay, yeah. All kinds of Anglo-Saxon and literary allusions in Lion King, by the way. It's merely Hamlet. So, they had to obey him, grant him tribute. And then we get to, for the first time in the poem, a line we're going to hear 3 times. Okay? That was good king. Literally, that was good king. Which in modern English we'd say, but that's not grammatical, so we would do, but that was a good king. We would throw in an indefinite article. Okay? Why is he called a good king? Because of everything that comes before. Okay? He deprives others of their meat benches. I hate that translation. He's not deprived. Another, I think the Norton translation, I think it might be Seamus Haynes, says deprives. Like, excuse me, can I borrow your seat? Not what's said, okay? What else? He strikes fear into earls and other tribes. He is so fearsome that tribes from the surrounding areas pay him tribute. He's a good king. So what's the mark of a good king? You expand your kingdom?
Kill.
He's a scary bastard, okay? You expand your kingdom. You rule through what? Is it that your own people fear you?
Others. Yes, sir.
Do we have any world leaders like this today? I don't know, if you lived in eastern Ukraine or the Crimea, who would this describe? I like to nickname him Vlad the Impaler. Putin. Okay? People within the old Soviet bloc, the old satellite people in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're kind of quaking because of what is going on their border and because of what the Russians are saying on just the other side of the border. They're saying there's a lot of Russian speakers in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Estonia, who are being abused, who are being downtrodden, etc., by the Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians. And they're just waiting for Putin to rush in, which is why the United States has moved a very small force into the three Baltic states. They're kind of a tripwire. Okay? Russia moves, America gets attacked, boom. All hell breaks loose. Okay? So, he's feared, but not by his own people. He's feared by others. Why? You attack, and he's going to answer. He attacks, and you're going to do what? Roll over and play dead, or die. Okay? So he's a good king. The first time that phrase is used, it's going to be used 2 other times for 2 other kings. One of those times, however, it's going to be prefaced with one word. Ak. Ak is Old English for but. Why? Because in this instance, when ak is used, somebody else is being praised. And then the poet remembers Hrothgar. It says, well, Hrothgar was a good king too, kind of implied. But we'll get to that. Okay? So, a boy was born to him, to Scyld Sheving. So notice the genealogy we're getting. We have Shafe, Scyld, the boy born to Scyld, who's called Beowulf. Notice I only put Beow. Why not? Abbreviation? Most other editors, Musa doesn't do this, most other editors change the Beowulf that's mentioned here to Beow. Because they say the person copying the poem down, which implies what? Okay, it's not that it's a translation, but that it is an actual copy. That the person has something in front of him that he's literally copying. Okay? So it's an assumption that they're copying an older version. Okay? They assume that the scribe copying it makes a mistake here and puts in this. And that the poem that the scribe is copying from actually only has this. But he throws in the oath because he's already read the copy, and he knows that throughout much of the rest of the poem, there's this guy named Beowulf. And he just kind of mentally slips at this point. But there's nothing in the actual text of the poem that we have that proves that. Okay? So, the user leaves Beowulf. He gives us the footnote not the monster-slaying hero of the title. Bear in mind, the title's not in the manuscript. There is no title in the manuscript. Okay? It just literally starts. You turn the page from what's on the, from what's over here, and it just starts, what? Wegardenas in Yardagum, etc. Okay? So, many scholars argue that the original name was Beowulf, with nothing else said. Okay? So, he includes Beowulf. Why? Because that's what the manuscript actually says. You can see it. You can just barely see it on the manuscript image you have down here. It's 1, 2, 3. It's 4 lines up from the bottom, and it's the 5th word in. Doesn't look at all like modern English Beowulf. Okay, it's a lowercase b, for example. Okay, and then the W is an Old English win. So it kind of looks like this, the A, and the win looks kind of like that, and then you have the U, LFES, etc. Okay, so Beowulf, the son of Scyld. Now let me back up. A boy was later born to him, young in the courts, whom God sent as a solace to the people. So notice what the speaker of the poem is saying. God sent this young son, Beowulf, as a solace, a comfort, okay, to the people. He, probably God, even though Liuza doesn't translate it as capitalized, he saw their need, the dire distress they had endured, lordless, for such a long time. What do you mean lordless for such a long time? I thought they had Scyld shiving just before him. Well, the indication is that there is a break here. And there may also be a break here. Okay? So-and-so as the son of so-and-so might not mean literal immediate descendant. Might just mean like, oh, well, there might be 4 or 5 removes, but it's still a son of. If you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, what does the White Witch ask Edmund when he gets into Narnia? Are you a son of Adam? And he's like, what? Well, yeah, he is a son of Adam. He's not a direct. Okay? So, the Lord of Life, the wielder of glory, gave him worldly honor, that is, Beowulf. Beowulf, the son of Scyld, notice, again, not directly, he is directly there. Beowulf, the son of Scyld, was renowned. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. And then we get a gnomic passage. Okay? Gnomic. Or individually, you could call it a gnome. It's not one of the little plastic guys you put in your garden. So what's meant by this? It's a piece of wisdom or proverb poetry. Sometimes they're a little enigmatic and hard to figure out, but usually they're kind of straightforward. So here's this first little gnome. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions. Okay, what does thus usually imply? Therefore. What usually comes before therefore? There's a context. There's some kind of like equation up above. 1 + 1 equals, therefore, 2 kind of a thing. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions. Well, what does that mean? How do you bring about good from your father's possessions? Pious gifts, notice. What we talked about previously, not today. What's one of the marks of a good king? Distributing gifts. Okay? So, the idea is he takes the material goods that his father owned and he distributes them. Why? so that later in life, loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him. With praiseworthy deeds, a man will prosper among any people. See, I think this little passage is actually referring to Beowulf, the guy who kills Grendel and the dragons. Grendel and the dragon. Why? Because this passage is talking about something Beowulf does do. He does distribute treasure. But it's alluding to something his men don't do. They don't stand by him in war. We're going to see. One does, but all the others don't. Right? Shield passed away at his appointed hour. The word for appointed there is phaya, his fated hour. The mighty Lord went into the Lord's keeping. They bore him down to the brimming sea. And we get a long passage describing how Shield-Shaving is buried. How's he buried? He's not. Buried implies what? You dig a hole, you put him in the ground, you cover him up. They don't dig any hole for Shield-Shaving. What do? Like Boromir in Lord of the Rings, they put him on a boat. They load treasure around him. Send him out into the sea. What do they not do to him? They don't set him on fire. Most films of Beowulf, if they include the Shield-Shaving part, they put him in the boat, they set him out to sea, they get him a good 200, 300, 400 yards away so we can see just how good an archer this archer is. The guy lights his arrow, and, how big is the boat? Maybe 20 feet, 400 yards away? No way. Not even Hawkeye and, the Avengers is going to nail that shot. So, he gets buried. Interesting little tidbit here. Let's call this a kind of a verbal sidebar. I've mentioned before in class Sutton Hoo. The Sutton Hoo discovery in 1939. I'll put some links up to D2L. I'll put some links up with pictures that I took of the Sutton Hoo material this summer, which are better than the ones that are in the book. Sutton Hoo is an archaeological site in East Anglia, Suffolk, England, that in 1939 there was a discovery. Okay? This woman named Edith, starts with a P. I'm drawing a complete blank on her last name. She owned a fairly large piece of property that had a bunch of mounds on it. 20 plus of these barrows. Okay? And she knew they're burial mounds. Because they're not natural forming mounds. And so she hires a local archaeologist, whose last name also escapes me, Basil something or other. And he comes and he starts digging into the mound. Okay, now keep in mind, this is 1939. What's about to happen? World War II is about to break out. Okay? So the summer of 1939, he cuts into the mound, and he discovers, lo and behold, the outline, not the remains, because the remains have rotted away, but the outline of a Viking longship. Or, put it another way, the outline of a longship. Might be too early for Vikings. Okay? And you can see pictures of, when they excavate, you can see the impression in the sand of all the planks of the side of the ship, and you can actually see rust marks where the rivets were that nailed the planks together, essentially. This thing's like 110 feet long, or 90 feet long. Somewhere between 90 and 110 feet long. It's like 30 to 40 feet wide and a good 20 or 30 feet deep. Okay? This is the longship I mentioned that was rowed up the River Deben, rolled on logs, 2 feet up a hill, and then covered over with dirt. Okay? In it was, the boat looked kind of like this. Okay? In it, there had been some kind of shack or house building. Okay? And if there was a person buried in here, he would have been in here. Okay? But what they did find in there were the remains of a shield, the remains of a sword, the remains of a knife, something like 43 gold coins, Merovingian coins, some of them, which dates it to, the coins at least date to as early as, I think it is the 540s, and the oldest of the coins dated to the 620s. Okay? Coat of mail, almost completely rusted. You go look at it today, it looks like a ball of rust. Okay? The remains of a shield, the shield is 3 feet in diameter, and it's round. Okay? Remains of a helmet, and a bunch of other stuff. Okay? Solid gold belt buckle, gold and cloisonne glass, shoulder clasps that keep the front part of a tunic connected to the back part. Okay? The belt buckle is just big belt buckle like this. Part of a purse lid. It was inside that the 43 coins were found, etc. A standard, like a pennant, shaped kind of like this. It's got 4 corners, and on each of those 4 corners is a post, which originally was thought maybe these held candles, but now it's kind of thought they held flags of some kind. Right? Just a whole bunch of stuff. Greatest discovery of Anglo-Saxon England. Right? So the next thing to do is they have to determine, who does this belong to? See, because England has this law that if you discover, and they had it prior to 1939, if you discover treasure, the coroner has to hold an inquest to determine who it belongs to. Why? Because it determines why it was put into the ground. If it is grave goods, that is, if the material was buried as part of an actual burial, never to be taken out of the ground again, then it belongs to the person upon whose ground it is discovered. If, however, the coroner determines it was put into the ground with the idea of there's a raid coming, let's bury our treasure, we'll come back later and dig it up. If it's treasure, then it belongs to the crown. That is, then it belongs to England. So they had to have an inquest, a coroner's inquest, to determine why this thing was put here. Well, there was no body. Why? Because the soil is very acidic. Flesh, gets eaten away quickly, as do bones. So, what kind of evidence do they propose? Do they put into evidence? This passage from Beowulf is entered into evidence that this is, in fact, a burial. They're not saying this is Scyld-Scylding's boat, but they are saying this is how people in this time period were buried. Because this is pretty much the same time period. It's very, very close. Right? And the coroner determines, yep, grave goods. It all belongs to Edith Petty. It's hers, everything. And this is hugely wealthy, okay? She immediately gives it to England. She says, no, this isn't mine. This is everybody's. This is all of England's. Okay? So you go to the British Museum today, and you can see the original artifacts. You go to the Sutton Hoo site, which now is a big thing, and some of the original stuff is there, but you also have artifact copies of it there. But you can walk around, you can see the mound, you can walk around and see all the other mounds, most of which, I believe, have by now been investigated. Okay? So, he goes off, notice, the same way he arrived. And the poet, in fact, says, line 50, men do not know how to say truly, not trusted counselors, nor heroes under the heavens, who received that cargo. Okay? Scyld-Scylding arrives and leaves the same way on a boat. Then Beowulf Scylding, beloved king, was famous in the strongholds of his folk for a long while. Okay? After Beowulf arrives, we're told, Halfdane. Okay? And Halfdane is discussed briefly, as are his children. Harogar, Hrothgar, Halaga, Til, and his daughter. Okay? So you have Shave Baal, and from Beowulf, Halfdane. Okay? Halfdane, historical. He really lived. And from Halfdane, we then get Harogar, Hrothgar, Halaga, an unknown daughter, unnamed daughter. When we get to the Gates or Yats, however you want to pronounce the names, guess what? We have a father named Hrevel, and then we have Hathkin, Haribald, Helak, unnamed daughter. Unnamed daughter marries Beowulf's father. Okay? We do know the daughter's name, or we have a pretty good idea of the daughter's name. It's Yrsa, who, kind of in modern Swedish, is Ursula. Okay? Like Ursula Andress, one of the famous Bond girls in one of the early James Bond movies. She marries a guy named Onela, who we're going to meet later on in the poem, who's a pretty rotten person. Okay? Though he is one of the other kings that is called Fatwa's Gold King. Interestingly. So, we meet these individuals. And we find out success in battle was given to Hrothgar. What about Harogar? Primogeniture still, reigns at this point, which means, as my son likes to remind my daughter, who's older than him, my eldest son likes to remind my eldest daughter, oldest son gets it all. He calls himself the heir. She calls him the airhead. What about Harogar? Well, we're going to find out about Harogar later. But the poet's kind of trying to get us straight to what the focus of the action is. So we're introduced to Hrothgar. Success in war was given to Hrothgar, honor in battle, so that his kinsmen eagerly serve him. That is, people want to become thanes of Hrothgar. Until the young soldiers grew into a mighty troop of men. That is, the implication is you kind of have distant relatives coming to Hrothgar to sign up to be his thanes. So he comes up with the idea of building a great hall. It's going to be the greatest hall. Cue the Donald Trump language. It's going to be the hugest hall, the world's ever seen. And he's going to make the other nations pay for it, so to speak. Which is what happens. Look at what the poem says. Okay? The work was widely proclaimed, line 74, to many nations throughout this Middle Earth to come adorn the folkstead. What does that mean? They willingly paid for it. Why? Who's he descendant of? Shield the badass, as it were. Okay? So, we're told that in this hall, he's going to do what? Line 71. He would share everything with young and old that God had given him, except for the common land, that is, except for the land shared by all the people, and the lives of men. What does Hrothgar not deal in? Slaves, yeah, slaves and land. He doesn't give away the land that's held kind of by the Commonwealth, so to speak, and he doesn't deal in slaves. Okay? So he builds this beautiful hall. And we're told, line 80, the hall is named, before that, Heorot, Heorot, which means heart, like stag. Okay? And he remembers his boast. He gives out rings. The hall towers high, horn gabled. That means the front of the hall looks like this. Okay? These beams that are making up this gable come out like that, and they form kind of like horns, like a heart has, right? And at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the speaker says, it awaited hostile fires, the surges of war. The time was not yet at hand when the sword hate of sworn in-laws should arise after ruthless violence. It's like Hrothgar's getting ready to cut the tape And the speaker, the poet, if you want, tells us what is going to happen to the hall. It's going to burn down. Why? Because of the sword hate of sworn in-laws. What does in-laws mean? Your spouse's parents or your child's husband or wife. Okay? So what sworn in-laws are we talking about here? Very next line. Okay, so describe an argument within a family. There's a game show, Richard Dawson. Family Feud. Very next line. A bold demon who waited in darkness wretchedly suffered all the while. For every day he heard the joyful din, loud in the hall with the harp sound, the clear song of the shope. Okay, it says a bold demon. The Old English word here is found, if I remember correctly. What line is that? 86? No, sorry. Ellen Gast. Literally bold ghost. Gast, however, is the same word from which we also get not only ghost, but guest. So a bold guest. Okay? So when you hear that Grendel is called a demon, don't think modern, The Exorcist. He's not a fallen angelic spirit. He has a fleshly body. He's big. He eats people. Lock, stock, and barrel. So he's really big. He's got a big belly, so to speak. Right? So Grendel, yep. So what really angers Grendel in these lines? What are we told? He suffers all the while. Why? For every day, what does he hear? The joy in the hall. He hears singing. He hears the sound of the harp. Is Grendel angry and upset because he's not included? Is this what happens because those nasty Danes are a bunch of xenophobes? That's the way some people read it. Read John Gardner's Grendel, novel written in 1972, 74, where he kind of takes Grendel's perspective. I mean, it's full of all this existentialist angst BS. Okay? Take that aside. But it's kind of told from Grendel's perspective. A lot of the movies made of Beowulf are heavily influenced by Gardner's Grendel. We're getting the monster's point of view. Okay? The people on the other side of the walls point of view. He who knew how to tell the ancient tale of the origin of men said that the Almighty created the earth. That is, here's what Grendel is hearing. This is the song. What's it a song of? Like Cadman's hymn, it's a song of creation. And I always like to think, is the poet talking about Cadman's hymn? Right? Whether it's early or late, could be. So the people live in joy, blessedly, line 100, until one began to work his foul crimes, a fiend from hell. Literally, a fan un hella. Okay? Hella there is not referring to the Germanic hell, the place of the dead, a really cold place. Okay? This is the Christian hell. So this is the Christian poet bringing in that kind of ideology and mentality. So the people live in joy until Grendel comes. And we're told this grim spirit was called Grendel. Grendel is related, I know it's time. Grendel is related to the verb grindon. We still hear it today. To grind. It's probably kind of how he eats his victims. Grinds them to bits. All right, we'll pick up around line 100. See, we're not too far behind, just 500 lines. But we'll try to get caught up. Have a good weekend.